Join us on Wings of Change, a compelling story where a seemingly ordinary flight turns into a life-altering journey for everyone on board. Meet the Thompsons, whose quiet strength in the face of subtle challenges sparks a chain reaction of self-reflection and unexpected kindness. Follow Maya, a young artist whose resilience inspires both her family and a once dismissive passenger named Brandon, who must confront his own behavior as turbulence shakes more than just the plane. What secrets about the Thompsons will be revealed, and how will one small gesture ripple through the lives of those on board? Find out in this story of empathy, change, and the power of the smallest acts. Be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below as we embark on this uplifting journey together. Let's get started. The terminal at JFK Airport was a flurry of hurried voices, rolling suitcases, and the metallic clang of luggage carts. The floor gleamed under the afternoon light streaming through the massive windows, illuminating the throngs of passengers moving in purposeful disarray. Amid this symphony of departure, 10-year-old Maya Thompson stood at Gate 32, holding her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Her wide, dark eyes reflected the nervous excitement coursing through her. Today, she was flying to San Francisco, and though this wasn't her first flight, it felt special in a way she couldn't quite explain. Beside her, Elise Thompson adjusted the strap of her sleek leather handbag and smoothed her tailored blouse. Tall and poised, Elise emanated an air of quiet authority that drew second glances from those around her. Her gaze flickered briefly to her husband, James, who checked his phone with the practiced efficiency of someone used to juggling a dozen responsibilities at once. James's easy smile and broad frame spoke of warmth and strength. He was the type of man who could command a room without raising his voice. "Mom, how high do you think we'll fly this time?" Maya asked, her voice a mix of wonder and curiosity. Elise's eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. "Very high, sweetheart. High enough to see clouds that look like castles." Maya grinned, her earlier nerves dissipating at the thought. The sky had always been her favorite canvas, and she couldn't wait to draw it. A few feet away, the Caldwell family stood in a neat line, their clothes pressed and perfect. Vanessa Caldwell, her sharp eyes framed by designer glasses, glanced sideways at the Thompsons before turning to her teenage son, Brandon. Brandon, with his neatly styled blonde hair and perpetual smirk, whispered something to his father, Nathan, and chuckled under his breath. Maya caught the sound, an odd cutting edge to it that made her fingers clench around her sketchbook. She didn't understand what was said, but the way Brandon's eyes slid toward her told her enough. Elise, catching the subtle shift in Maya's posture, rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The silent gesture said, "I see you. I'm here. Attention passengers of Flight 216 to San Francisco, we are now boarding first class," the attendant announced, her crisp voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. James touched Maya's arm lightly. "That's us, kiddo," he said, his smile steadying her as they moved to join the line. Elise walked beside them, her eyes scanning the room with the vigilance of someone who'd learned not to let her guard down. The Thompsons settled into their first-class seats, Maya by the window, Elise next to her, and James across the aisle. The luxury of the cabin, with its plush leather seats and attentive staff, did little to erase the unease that lingered after Brandon's whispered snicker. Maya opened her sketchbook, focusing on the clean, blank page that promised escape. "Remember what I told you about drawing clouds?" James said from his seat, tilting his head just enough to catch her eye. "Look for the shapes," Maya recited with a small smile. "They're never just clouds." James winked, pleased. It was a game they often played, finding dragons, ships, and entire cities hidden in the sky's shifting tapestry. Maya's pencil moved instinctively, sketching the first arc of what would become a towering, castle-like cloud formation. Brandon settled in a few rows behind, leaning into his seat with exaggerated ease. He glanced at Maya, an amused glint in his eye as he whispered something again to his parents. Vanessa Caldwell arched an eyebrow but said nothing, her expression a mixture of aloofness and mild disapproval. Elise, ever observant, turned just enough to make eye contact with Brandon. Her look was not one of reprimand, but of firm acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you too." As the plane taxied down the runway, Maya's heart raced. She glanced out the window, the runway lines blurring as the engines roared to life. She sketched frantically, trying to capture the moment before the ground fell away beneath them. The ascent was smooth, and soon the world below shrank to a patchwork of green and gray. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight reached cruising altitude. Passengers began to settle in, unbuckling seatbelts and adjusting their seats. A flight attendant, Jason Perez, moved through the aisle with practiced ease, offering drinks and snacks with a smile that came as naturally as breathing. His eyes paused on Maya's sketch, noticing the intricate, careful details she'd already penciled in. "Quite an artist we have here," he said lightly, making Maya blush with a shy smile. Jason's attention shifted momentarily to the Caldwells as Brandon leaned over to his mother, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Looks like we've got a child prodigy on board," he said, the sarcasm thinly veiled. Vanessa's eyes darted between her son and Elise, who met the moment with a steady gaze. Jason's smile stiffened, his professional demeanor smoothing over the awkwardness before he moved on. Maya felt the sting of the words but forced herself to refocus, tracing the lines of her drawing with renewed determination. James, watching the interaction from across the aisle, shifted in his seat, the muscles in his jaw tightening briefly before relaxing. He met Elise's eyes and nodded, a silent pact to let it go for now. Jason Perez moved through the cabin with a practiced rhythm, eyes constantly sweeping for details. He'd worked flights filled with CEOs, celebrities, and everything in between. And he'd learned that first class was often where entitlement sat, like an uninvited guest. But today, there was something different in the air, a tension that settled between rows like fog. He paused at the galley to refill a tray and caught Rebecca Mill's eye, his fellow flight attendant. She raised an eyebrow. "Everything good up front?" she asked, her tone casual but knowing. Jason glanced toward the Thompsons, then back at the Caldwells. "Just the usual," he said with a small shrug. But as he looked back into the cabin, his eyes landed on Maya, pencil poised mid-air, her young face marked by an expression too guarded for her age. Something inside him stirred, a reminder that little moments carried weight. The cabin settled into a quiet hum as passengers adjusted to the rhythms of the flight. The low murmur of conversation, the occasional clinking of glasses, and the soft shuffling of newspapers filled the air. Maya's pencil scratched lightly against the paper as she sketched the billowing curves of the clouds outside. Brandon Caldwell's voice, however, broke the tranquility. He leaned toward his mother, making sure his words carried just enough to reach Maya's ears. "I don't get why people bring their kids to first class. It's not like they appreciate it?" Vanessa shifted slightly but said nothing, her gaze flickering between her son and Elise. James, though across the aisle and appearing engrossed in his book, felt the undercurrent of the comment and glanced up just long enough to catch Maya's small, almost imperceptible flinch. "Everything all right, Maya?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Maya nodded, biting her lip to suppress the prickle of unease that crept up her spine. She looked back at her sketch, determined to focus on the comforting lines of her art. James closed his book, not even pretending to read now. His eyes moved between Maya's focused expression and Brandon's lingering smirk. He leaned across the aisle toward Elise. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice low enough to blend into the cabin noise. Elise nodded subtly. Her eyes held the same calm resolve that James knew well, a look that spoke of holding the line without words. They had encountered moments like this before. Small slights dressed in the guise of casual remarks. It was nothing new, but each time it pulled at something deep inside them both. "I'll talk to her later," Elise said, her voice soft yet unwavering. James nodded and reached into his bag, pulling out a small, well-worn book of poems that he handed to Maya. She accepted it gratefully, letting her father's quiet encouragement wrap around her like a protective layer. An hour into the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The seatbelt sign dinged on with a soft chime as the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, We're expecting a bit of turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Passengers adjusted in their seats, expressions ranging from mild concern to indifference. Maya felt her heart thud a little harder, but she kept her eyes on the book, letting the familiar words steady her. Elise's hand rested lightly on her daughter's arm, an unspoken assurance that they were fine. Brandon, sensing the moment as an opportunity, whispered a mock-serious, "Oh no, we're going down," loud enough for Maya and those nearby to hear. A few passengers turned their heads, frowning at the remark, while others smirked, dismissing it as typical teenage humor. Maya's pencil paused on the page, her breath catching. Elise's hand tightened slightly on her arm, signaling that they noticed but would not react. Brandon's parents exchanged a quick, disapproving glance before returning to their magazines, choosing to let the moment pass. Jason Perez, now circulating through the cabin to ensure everyone was secure, paused near the Thompsons and caught Elise's eye. His brows knitted briefly before he forced a polite smile. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine concern. Elise nodded. "We're fine, thank you," she said, the warmth in her tone making it clear that the question was appreciated. Jason moved on, but made a mental note of the exchange. He noticed the flicker of discomfort on Maya's face, the way she shrank a little in her seat when Brandon's voice echoed through the cabin again, this time mimicking a cartoonish fear. The plane jolted slightly, a small reminder of the captain's warning. A soft gasp rippled through the rows, quickly quieted by reassurances. Jason continued his round, stopping briefly at Brandon's row. He leaned in, his voice professional yet pointed. "Sir, I need you to keep it down, please." Brandon's smirk wavered, replaced by a brief look of surprise. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably but did not argue. The subtle warning had its intended effect, and the cabin settled back into relative quiet. Maya's pencil moved again, but now with more deliberate strokes. Her drawing shifted from clouds to a scene she remembered from her grandmother's stories. An old oak tree standing tall against a sky full of storm clouds. The metaphor wasn't lost on her, even at 10 years old. Strength didn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it meant holding firm, like the roots of a tree, unyielding in the wind. Elise watched Maya's drawing with a small smile, recognizing the image. It was a testament to how deeply their lessons had taken root in their daughter. James, noticing too, shared a look with Elise that spoke of pride and understanding. The turbulence eventually passed, leaving behind a subtle change in the cabin's atmosphere. Passengers resumed their activities, but there was an awareness now, a collective attention to what had unfolded. Lisa Morgan, seated a few rows ahead, glanced back at the Thompsons. The small family intrigued her. She had noticed Brandon's comments, the tension, and the silent way Elise had chosen not to escalate the situation. It was a lesson in dignity that made Lisa think about her own responses in moments like this. How silence sometimes spoke louder than words. Jason returned, this time offering refreshments. He handed Maya a glass of water with a quiet, "Good job weathering that storm." Maya's eyes brightened, and she nodded, taking the compliment for more than it seemed. As the cabin settled back into its rhythm, the Thompsons sat a little taller, their shared resilience invisible but palpable. Brandon, now subdued, turned to his window, the shadow of uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The flight continued smoothly after the brief spell of turbulence, and the cabin settled into a comfortable lull. The low hum of conversation mixed with the soft beeping of the attendants' call buttons. The sun, now high in the sky, cast golden patches of light through the small windows, dancing across Maya's drawing as she added final touches to her oak tree. Elise leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. James, who had resumed reading, shifted slightly to check on Maya and gave her an encouraging smile when she met his gaze. Brandon sat slouched in his seat, staring out the window at the vast expanse of sky. The earlier jolt of Jason's quiet rebuke had left him feeling unsettled, though he wouldn't admit it. Vanessa noticed the change in her son and sighed inwardly. The lesson he needed couldn't be taught in a single flight, but she hoped seeds were being planted. Across the aisle, Lisa Morgan couldn't help but steal another glance at the Thompsons. There was something quietly compelling about the way they carried themselves, particularly Elise. Her grace, in the face of Brandon's earlier comment, had left an impression, one that Lisa found herself turning over in her mind like a stone. Halfway through the flight, an attendant approached Elise with a polite smile. "Mrs. Thompson, the captain would like a word with you," she said, her voice respectful, but carrying the authority of the request. Passengers nearby turned their heads, curiosity flickering across their faces. Elise exchanged a look with James, who nodded subtly. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and followed the attendant toward the cockpit, her composure unbroken. Maya watched her mother with wide eyes, wondering what could be so important. Brandon's curiosity was piqued, and he whispered, "Why would the captain need to talk to her?" His father, Nathan, gave a non-committal grunt, eyes never leaving his newspaper. Vanessa, though outwardly calm, tracked Elise's movement with newfound interest. Elise returned a few minutes later, her expression serene but thoughtful. She settled back into her seat and met James's questioning glance with a small nod, as if to say, "Everything is fine." Maya reached for her mother's hand, and Elise squeezed it gently, an unspoken reassurance. Meanwhile, Jason Perez finished distributing drinks and took a brief moment to lean against the galley counter. His eyes swept the cabin, noting the subtle shifts in mood. He saw the Thompsons settling back in, and felt a wave of respect for how Elise had handled herself earlier. It wasn't lost on him how poised they remained, even under the pressure of subtle scrutiny. Brandon, now quiet, looked at his mother. "Mom, do you think I was mean earlier?" he asked, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the ambient noise, but carrying a hint of uncertainty. Vanessa turned to her son, surprised by the question. "It's not always what we say, Brandon, but how it makes others feel," she said, her tone measured. "Think about that." The comment lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Brandon's brow furrowed, his mind replaying the way Maya had hunched over her sketchbook, the way Elise had looked at him without saying a word. It was a look that spoke of experience, of having heard and seen more than a few thoughtless comments. The plane glided smoothly through the sky, and Maya shifted her attention from her drawing to the scene outside the window. She spotted Jason as he passed again and offered him a small wave. Surprised but pleased, Jason leaned down slightly. "Enjoying the flight?" he asked. Maya nodded. "I'm drawing the clouds," she said, turning her sketchbook around to show him. Jason's eyebrows rose as he took in the detailed oak tree standing tall beneath the stormy sky she had sketched. "That's impressive," Jason said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've got real talent." Maya beamed, the earlier discomfort forgotten for the moment. James glanced over and smiled approvingly at Jason, appreciating the kindness he showed his daughter. The attendant stood a little straighter as he walked away, buoyed by the unexpected exchange. The soft chime of the intercom interrupted the quiet, and the captain's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a clear day ahead and anticipate an early arrival into San Francisco. Thank you for flying with us." The announcement drew relieved smiles and sparked a gentle buzz of conversation. The shift in tone reached even the Caldwells. Vanessa settled back in her seat, the tension in her shoulders easing. Brandon, glancing at Maya's drawing once more, felt an unexpected pang of regret for how he'd behaved earlier. Lisa Morgan took in the change around her and leaned slightly to whisper to Sam Rivers, who had been dozing beside her. "It's interesting, isn't it? The way a simple flight can reveal so much about people." Sam blinked sleepily, then nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's like a microcosm of the world up here," he replied. "You learn a lot about character when there's nowhere to go." The flight settled into a steady rhythm as the afternoon sun softened, casting a warm glow over the passengers. Maya had dozed off, her sketchbook resting on her lap, while Elise sipped on a cup of tea, her eyes distant but vigilant. James leaned back, observing the shifting moods in the cabin. A quiet stillness settled, but it felt fragile, as though one jolt could splinter the peace. Brandon sat with his headphones on, pretending to be absorbed in a game on his tablet. Every now and then, his gaze flitted to the Thompsons, his earlier smugness now replaced by an expression that hinted at discomfort. Vanessa watched her son with the sharp eyes of a mother who recognized when her child was caught between right and wrong. The weight of realizing that small moments could teach big lessons. Suddenly, the plane shuddered, a slight dip that jolted passengers awake. Elise's cup rattled on her tray, and Maya stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she gripped the armrest instinctively. The cabin buzzed with murmurs as people glanced out their windows, searching for a cause. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a small patch of turbulence. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened as we ride it out. Thank you for your cooperation." The murmurs quieted, but an undercurrent of tension lingered. Brandon shifted nervously, looking out at the clouds that now seemed closer, more ominous. He forced himself to glance at Maya, who was gripping her pencil like a lifeline. Their eyes met for a split second before he looked away, cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Maya's heart pounded as the plane jostled again, this time more sharply. She felt her mother's hand on her arm and turned to see Elise's calm expression. "We're fine, sweetheart," Elise said softly. The steadiness in her voice was like an anchor, and Maya forced herself to nod, even as her pulse drummed in her ears. James leaned across the aisle. "Just like those waves we watched at the beach, remember?" he said, referring to their last vacation. "They come and go, but we're always safe." Maya's breathing steadied slightly, but the tension still knotted her stomach. She looked out the window at the roiling clouds, trying to see the shapes in them as her father had taught her. But today, they didn't look like castles or dragons. Today, they looked like storms. The plane leveled out, but the air in the cabin remained thick with unease. Brandon, feeling his own nerves prickling under his skin, covered it the only way he knew how, with humor that cut more than it amused. He leaned over to Vanessa, whispering loud enough for those nearby to catch, "Maybe we'll see a flying lesson soon." Vanessa shot him a look, her lips tightening. Elise's expression hardened, a flicker of disappointment crossing her features as she glanced at Brandon. Maya didn't react outwardly, but she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her pencil. Jason, making his way through the cabin to check on passengers, caught the tail end of Brandon's comment. His professional mask stayed intact, but the slight narrowing of his eyes revealed his disapproval. He knelt by Maya, pretending to adjust the tray table. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. Maya nodded again, this time with more conviction. Jason gave her a reassuring wink and moved on, subtly positioning himself near the Caldwell's row as a silent reminder. As the cabin quieted, Elise's gaze drifted to the horizon outside the window. The clouds shifted, dark and layered, and she was momentarily transported back to a day from her childhood. A summer afternoon at her grandparents' house, where she'd stood in the kitchen listening to her grandmother's stories about resilience and pride. Her grandmother had faced prejudice in school and on the job, but she had always spoken about it with a calm that belied the storms she'd weathered. "Don't let them see you break, Ellie. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet." The words echoed in Elise's mind, grounding her as the plane hummed around her. James looked at her, sensing where her thoughts had wandered. He reached across the aisle and brushed her fingertips, a silent reminder that they were in this together. The plane jolted once more, harder this time, and the cabin filled with startled gasps. Overhead compartments rattled, and a bag fell into the aisle, spilling its contents. A baby cried out from the back, and an older woman clutched her armrest, eyes squeezed shut. Maya's heart leaped into her throat, but she watched her mother and father taking cues from their calm. James maintained his easy smile, even as his eyes kept a careful watch on the cabin crew. Elise's steady hand stayed on Maya's arm, applying just enough pressure to reassure. Brandon's bravado cracked as he gripped his seat, a flash of fear crossing his face. Vanessa noticed, her expression softening. She reached for her son's hand, something she hadn't done in years, and squeezed it. He looked at her, startled, then relaxed slightly under her touch. The plane steadied, and the flight attendants moved quickly to secure the loose bag and reassure passengers. Jason, catching his breath, made his way down the aisle, nodding to those who met his eyes. When he reached Maya's row, he paused, the corners of his mouth lifting in a subtle smile. "You're braver than most," he said quietly to her, and Maya's lips curled into a tentative smile. For the first time since the turbulence began, she felt a thread of confidence weaving through her fear. Brandon watched the interaction from a few rows back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His earlier mockery now felt hollow, and he glanced at his mother, who nodded as if to say, "It's time to think about who you want to be." The cabin buzzed with muted conversations as passengers settled back into their seats, the adrenaline of the turbulence slowly ebbing away. James glanced around, taking in the subtly changed mood. There was a tension that felt sharper, a shared realization that while the sky outside was unpredictable, their behavior inside the cabin was within their control. Elise stroked Maya's hair, the rhythmic motion lulling her daughter back into a calmer state. Maya looked up, her dark eyes meeting her mother's. The faintest trace of a smile curved Elise's lips, and Maya responded with a tiny nod, as if to say, "I'm okay now." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to shake the guilt that had settled like a stone in his chest. The baby's cry from earlier replayed in his mind, mingling with the nervous glances exchanged by passengers. He looked at Maya, who was now quietly drawing again, her pencil stroke steadier than before. Brandon reached for the tray table and set down his tablet. The animated game screen blinked back at him, bright and mindless. He pressed the power button and let the screen go black. The sound of laughter, real and unaffected, caught his ear, and he glanced sideways at a group of kids in coach, sharing a single pair of earbuds and giggling over a movie. He thought back to the last time he had laughed like that, openly, without hesitation. It felt like a distant memory. Brandon's eyes returned to Maya, the girl he had mocked earlier. The determination in her face, even when she was scared, gnawed at him. He didn't know how to describe the feeling, but it made him uncomfortable enough to shift in his seat again. "Everything okay, honey?" Vanessa's voice was softer now, a rare tone reserved for moments when she sensed that he needed it most. Brandon hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I guess," he said, though the words felt incomplete. Jason Perez paused by the Thompsons' row, offering Maya a second glass of water. "I thought you might like a refill," he said, his eyes crinkling at the edges. Elise nodded in gratitude, sensing the unspoken kindness in Jason's actions. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm but reserved. The flight attendant moved on, but not before giving Maya another small nod of encouragement. Brandon watched the exchange and felt an impulse that surprised him. Before he could second-guess it, he reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper from the in-flight magazine. He began folding it, his fingers moving with a familiar precision he hadn't used in years. Within minutes, he had shaped the paper into a small, simple crane. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, he leaned forward and gently placed the crane on the tray in front of Maya's seat. She looked up, startled, and met his eyes. He offered a small, hesitant smile before retreating back into his seat. Maya stared at the crane, a mixture of surprise and curiosity playing on her face. Elise noticed and arched an eyebrow in silent question. Maya simply shrugged and picked up the crane, examining its delicate folds. The plane shuddered again, though only lightly this time. Passengers tensed, and then relaxed when it became clear it was not the start of another rough patch. The cabin's collective exhale was almost audible. Elise's gaze lingered on the crane in Maya's hands, recognizing it as a peace offering. She glanced back at Brandon, who quickly looked away, cheeks flushing with embarrassment. It was a small gesture, but significant, a crack in the armor he wore so confidently. Jason, making his way back up the aisle, caught sight of the exchange and raised an eyebrow, wondering at the subtle shift he had witnessed. The first-class cabin felt different now, quieter and more introspective. Lisa Morgan closed her eyes, pressing her head back against the seat. She had watched the interaction unfold, small as it was, and felt an odd sense of hope stir within her. It reminded her of her own children, now grown and scattered across the country. They, too, had struggled with moments of insecurity and misunderstanding. "Sam, did you see that?" she asked, nudging the man beside her. He looked up from the crossword puzzle he had been pretending to focus on. "See what?" Sam's voice was groggy, thick with the remnants of a nap. "Just people, how they change, even when they don't mean to," Lisa replied, her gaze drifting back to the Thompsons. Sam followed her line of sight and nodded slowly. "Funny, isn't it? How a flight like this can feel like a whole story in itself." The captain's voice returned, this time more relaxed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're clear of turbulence and should be arriving ahead of schedule. Thank you for your patience." The announcement was met with quiet relief, and the cabin's energy shifted to a more peaceful state. Brandon felt Vanessa's hand on his arm, a touch that carried more understanding than words. He didn't acknowledge it aloud, but he leaned into it just enough for her to know he felt it. Maya set the paper crane gently on the edge of her sketchbook, tracing its folded wings with her finger. The gesture had given her something she didn't have earlier, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change for the better. The calm in the cabin after the captain's announcement brought a wave of quiet conversations and the rustling of newspapers. Maya leaned back in her seat, still holding the paper crane that Brandon had made. She studied its precise folds, wondering what had prompted the gesture. Elise noticed her daughter's thoughtful expression and bent down slightly. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the crane. Maya turned it over in her hands and smiled faintly. "Mom, why do some people act mean when they're scared?" Maya asked, her voice low. Elise paused, the question carrying weight that stretched beyond their current moment. "Sometimes," Elise said, choosing her words carefully, "people don't know how to show their fear. It comes out in ways that can hurt others, because that's the only way they know to feel strong." She brushed a curl away from Maya's face. "But it's not really strength, is it?" Maya shook her head, understanding in her own way. She glanced back at Brandon, who was pretending to sleep, and felt the sting of his earlier comments dull just a little. Jason Perez took a moment to breathe as he stood in the galley, eyes on the passengers. The tension that had permeated first class during the turbulence seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a tentative calm. He reached for his water bottle, thinking back to Maya's resilient smile and the paper crane he had noticed earlier. It wasn't just another flight, it was a reminder of why he loved this job. The glimpses of humanity that surfaced in unexpected ways. "Jason, all good?" Rebecca Mills, his fellow flight attendant, asked as she passed by, stacking trays. He nodded, a small smile breaking his usual professional demeanor. "Yeah, all good," he said, glancing toward the cabin. "Better than it started, I think." Brandon kept his eyes shut, his breathing steady as if he were asleep, but his mind buzzed. The weight of his mother's hand on his arm lingered, a touch that carried warmth and understanding. He thought about the look on Maya's face when she had first heard him laugh at her. It was a look he knew now was filled with more strength than he'd realized. He opened his eyes just enough to see Maya's paper crane resting on her tray table. The sight made him feel something unfamiliar, a mix of shame and a strange sort of hope that maybe he wasn't as bad as he feared. "Brandon," Vanessa said softly, leaning in, "you did a good thing today." Her voice held an assurance that made him exhale a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded slightly, the beginnings of a small, hopeful smile playing at his lips. Lisa Morgan shifted in her seat, feeling more awake than she had in weeks. She turned to Sam Rivers, who had folded up his crossword puzzle and was now staring thoughtfully out the window. "Did you ever think that one flight could feel like this much of a journey?" she asked, breaking the silence. Sam chuckled. "Not usually. But today, yeah. It's interesting what people reveal when they're all in the same boat. Well, plain." Lisa nodded, watching as Jason passed by, collecting cups and plates. She caught his eye and offered a smile, silently acknowledging his efforts during the flight. Jason returned it, feeling a warmth that made his long shifts worthwhile. As the plane began to approach its descent, the sun shifted lower on the horizon, casting soft, warm light through the cabin. The golden hues made the paper crane glow on Maya's tray, a delicate beacon in the midst of the leather and steel. Maya picked up her pencil and began a new drawing, this time of the crane itself, surrounded by the soft clouds outside. Brandon, stealing another glance, saw her sketch and felt a pang of something like pride mixed with regret. Vanessa caught her son's expression and patted his arm. It wasn't a grand gesture, but in their family, it was enough to signal that moments of change didn't have to be loud to matter. The intercom crackled as the captain spoke once more, his voice steady and sure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are upright. Thank you for flying with us." Passengers stirred, collecting their belongings and stretching their legs as much as the cramped cabin would allow. Elise tucked Maya's sketchbook back into her bag, pausing to look at the crane again. She glanced at Brandon, catching his eye for the briefest moment. He looked back, then quickly away, but not before giving a small, awkward nod. Jason made his way through the aisle one last time, ensuring everything was in order. When he passed Maya's row, he noticed the new drawing and let out a soft laugh. "That's a good one," he said, winking. Maya's face brightened, and Elise gave Jason a nod that conveyed gratitude beyond words. The flight was ending, but the small changes it had seeded would travel much further than the journey itself. As the plane descended, the hum of engines blended with the rustle of passengers preparing for landing. Jason Perez moved through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were up. When he reached the Thompsons' row, he paused, catching Elise's eye for a moment. There was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that was more than miles traveled. Maya glanced out the window, the rolling hills and glittering bay of San Francisco appearing as the plane descended through the cloud cover. The tension in her shoulders eased, replaced by a quiet excitement. She turned her gaze to the small paper crane on her tray table and touched its wings gently. Brandon shifted in his seat, craning his neck to see the view. The city, golden in the late afternoon sun, seemed distant and inviting, a world that held new possibilities. For a moment, the weight of the flight's earlier events lifted. The plane touched down smoothly, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. As it taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. We're pleased to announce that we've arrived ahead of schedule. We would like to extend a special thank you to the Thompsons for their support and continued commitment to this airline." The words hung in the air like an unexpected note, prompting curious glances from passengers. Elise remained composed, offering only a slight smile as she glanced at James, who nodded back. Brandon's eyes widened slightly, and he looked at his mother. Vanessa's expression softened, a blend of realization and quiet acknowledgement. She had sensed something unique about the family, but this confirmation deepened her respect. Jason, who was collecting last-minute items from passengers, paused in surprise. He met Elise's eyes, understanding now that their quiet strength was backed by influence. But it didn't change what he had already admired: their grace under pressure. Passengers leaned in close to their seatmates, whispering questions and observations. Lisa Morgan sat up straighter, replaying the events of the flight in her mind with new clarity. The subtle dignity with which Elise had handled Brandon's comments, the quiet confidence James exuded, it all made sense now. Maya, unaware of the sudden stir around her, focused on the drawing in her sketchbook. She was finishing the details of the paper crane, giving it wings that seemed ready to take flight. Brandon felt a flush creep up his neck. The weight of his earlier behavior pressed down harder now that he understood who the Thompsons really were. It wasn't their status that shamed him, but the realization that he had judged too quickly and too harshly. He glanced at Maya, watching her draw, and felt the gap between them widen with every passing second. As passengers began to rise from their seats, Elise stood, gathering her things with measured grace. She noticed Lisa Morgan giving her a nod of respect and returned it, a silent exchange that needed no words. Jason watched the small interactions unfold, feeling a swell of pride for how the flight had unfolded. "Excuse me, Mrs. Thompson." A man in a suit from across the aisle leaned over, extending a hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. I think we all learned something on this flight." Elise accepted the handshake, her smile kind but reserved. "Thank you. I believe we all have." Brandon watched, feeling the silent approval of his mother at his back. Summoning his courage, he took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, pausing beside Maya. "Hey," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Maya looked up, eyes wide with curiosity. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier," Brandon continued, his cheeks tinged pink. "It was wrong." Maya studied him for a moment before her face softened. "Thank you," she replied, her voice small but sincere. Brandon nodded, a weight lifting from his chest as he returned to his seat. Passengers filed out of the cabin, some casting lingering glances at the Thompsons, their expressions a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. Jason stood by the exit, bidding everyone farewell. When Elise passed him, he offered a firm handshake. "It was an honor to have you on board," he said, meaning every word. Elise's eyes sparkled with appreciation. "The honor was ours." "Thank you for your kindness," she replied. James gave Jason a nod, one that spoke of mutual understanding. Maya paused before stepping into the jet bridge and turned to look at Brandon one last time. He lifted his hand in a small wave, and she mirrored the gesture before turning away, the paper crane tucked safely into her sketchbook. The Thompsons walked into the bright terminal, the busy energy of the airport buzzing around them. Maya glanced up at the high glass ceilings and smiled. The flight had been more than a journey from one place to another. It had been a lesson in resilience, kindness, and unexpected connections. Lisa Morgan watched them go, feeling a shift within herself. She resolved that when she returned home, she would do more than watch. She would act, whether by supporting a coworker in need or simply choosing her words more thoughtfully. Brandon stepped into the terminal, his parents flanking him. The usual swagger in his step was gone, replaced by a thoughtful quiet. Vanessa glanced at her son, a small smile playing at her lips. Change, she knew, often started in the smallest moments. Jason stood by the plane's entrance, the hum of passengers disembarking around him. He watched the Thompsons disappear into the crowd, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Today's flight was one he would carry with him long after he hung up his uniform at the end of the day. As the passengers spilled into the terminal, the usual bustle of arrivals surrounded them. Families reuniting with hugs, business travelers checking their phones, and vacationers pausing to get their bearings. The Thompsons walked with a quiet confidence, their presence radiating a sense of calm and composure. Brandon trailed behind his parents, the sights and sounds of the busy terminal washing over him like static. He watched as Maya tucked her sketchbook under her arm, the paper crane peeking out from its pages. The weight of what he'd said and done during the flight sat heavy on his chest. But there was a hint of hope that he'd taken the first step toward something better. "Brandon?" Vanessa's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She rested a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture that spoke more than her words could. "Proud of you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with understanding. He nodded, managing a small smile. The rush of travelers moving past them felt less chaotic now, as though a new awareness had settled around him. Ahead, a cluster of reporters waited near the baggage claim, their cameras and microphones poised. Word of James Thompson's presence on the flight had spread, and the media were eager for a statement. James caught sight of them and exchanged a glance with Elise. They both knew that while the attention was not unexpected, it was never fully welcome. Elise leaned down to Maya. "We might need to talk to a few people before we leave, okay?" Maya nodded, her small fingers gripping her mother's hand a little tighter. The reporters' murmurs grew louder as the Thompsons approached, a few calling out questions that blended into a cacophony. James raised a hand, a signal for calm, and the noise subsided. "Mr. Thompson, can you share your thoughts on the flight?" one reporter asked, her voice clear and eager. James paused, his face thoughtful. Today's flight was a reminder that every journey, big or small, tests who we are and how we treat one another. It's not just about reaching a destination, it's about what we learn along the way. The reporters jotted down his words, nodding as they processed the subtle message. Elise stood beside him, her expression serene but strong, embodying the grace that had carried them through the day. As the Thompsons made their way to baggage claim, Maya looked up at her parents, a question forming on her lips. "Do you think that boy meant what he said when he apologized?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Elise and James exchanged a glance before James responded. "Sometimes people don't realize they're wrong until they're given a chance to see differently. I think he's starting to understand," he said, placing a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. Maya nodded, processing the idea. She thought back to the way Brandon had looked at her, no longer with mockery, but with something that resembled regret. It was a beginning, she realized, and beginnings could lead to change. Lisa Morgan pulled her suitcase from the baggage carousel, her thoughts still on the Thompsons and the subtle lessons of the flight. As she wheeled her luggage toward the exit, she spotted Sam Rivers, who was waiting for a ride. Their eyes met, and he raised a hand in a small wave. "Heading home?" Sam asked as she approached. "Yes," Lisa said, a smile tugging at her lips. "But I think I'll be heading somewhere new after that. I've got some things to rethink at work, and in life, too." Sam chuckled. "Flights like this remind us what matters, don't they?" "They do," Lisa agreed, her gaze following the Thompsons as they moved away, their heads held high. "They really do." Back on the plane, Jason Perez helped the crew tidy up and prepare for their next flight. The hum of conversation had faded, replaced by the focused energy of clearing trays and restocking carts. But Jason's mind lingered on the Thompsons, on the subtle shifts he'd witnessed, the silent exchanges, the quiet strength that spoke louder than any raised voice. Rebecca, his colleague, walked past with a stack of cups. "Quite a flight today, huh?" she said with a tired smile. Jason nodded, his smile small but genuine. "Yeah, more than just the miles." He took a moment at the window, watching as the terminal lights glowed against the dusky sky. He thought about the passengers, how they'd all been part of something more than a routine flight. The Thompsons' grace under pressure, Maya's resilience, and even Brandon's tentative steps toward growth had all left a mark. As the Thompsons reached their car, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the tarmac. Elise glanced at James, a question in her eyes that needed no words. "It's only a flight," James said, echoing a line they'd often used in jest. "But sometimes it's more." Maya climbed into the back seat, her sketchbook resting beside her, open to the drawing of the paper crane. She traced its wings with her finger, thinking of the story she would tell her friends, of how small moments could change everything. Brandon, standing with his parents a few yards away, watched them leave. He didn't know if they would ever see each other again, but he felt something shift within him. A determination to be better, to understand more. His mother's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ready?" Vanessa asked, her tone gentle, as if sensing his inner turmoil. "Yeah," Brandon replied, the weight in his chest easing as they turned to go. It wasn't just the end of the flight, it was the start of something new. The hum of conveyor belts echoed in the baggage claim area as passengers gathered around, waiting for their suitcases to appear. The Thompsons stood close together, their quiet conversation punctuated by the occasional announcement over the loudspeakers. Maya's eyes wandered as she took in the scene, catching sight of Brandon with his parents on the other side of the carousel. Brandon's posture was different now. He didn't stand with the same casual arrogance. Instead, there was an unfamiliar softness in his expression, as though he was seeing the world with new eyes. Vanessa watched him, her own thoughts tangled. She recognized the quiet shift in him, the kind that could signal change. Maya's gaze met Brandon's for a brief moment, and he offered a small, hesitant smile. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them on the plane. It was fragile, but it was real. As they waited, Elise leaned into James, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Today reminded me of something my mother used to say, that sometimes change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the smallest, most unexpected moments." James smiled, squeezing her hand. She was right. It's those moments that stay with people, that make them think long after they've walked away. Elise nodded, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and pride. "And I think we saw that today." Their luggage arrived, and James reached for it, his movements deliberate and steady. Maya helped by grabbing her backpack, her sketchbook peeking out from the top. The Caldwells lingered by the baggage carousel, Vanessa's hand resting on Brandon's shoulder. Nathan was absorbed in checking his phone, but Vanessa's focus remained on their son. "Brandon," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we don't always get a second chance to show who we really are. But when we do, we need to take it." Brandon looked up at her, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I know, Mom," he replied, the weight of the flight still pressing down on him, but now tempered by resolve. Vanessa's gaze shifted across the carousel to the Thompsons, who were walking toward the exit. She made a silent promise to herself that their family would do better, in both the little and the big ways. Jason Perez, having wrapped up his duties and changed into his street clothes, walked into the terminal just in time to see the last of the passengers from the flight disperse. He caught sight of the Thompsons heading toward the exit and felt compelled to say one last goodbye. He quickened his step and called out, "Maya!" She turned, her eyes lighting up as she recognized him. Jason reached them and smiled, a bit out of breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for reminding me why I do this job." Elise and James exchanged a warm look, appreciating the sincerity in his voice. Maya grinned and lifted her sketchbook, showing him the crane drawing. "I'll remember this flight," she said. Jason nodded, eyes bright. "Me too." With a final wave, the Thompsons stepped through the automatic doors into the California air, warm and full of promise. Jason stood for a moment, watching them go, before turning back into the bustling terminal, ready for whatever the next flight would bring. Lisa Morgan waited outside for her taxi, the airport's chaos a backdrop to her quiet thoughts. She pulled out her phone and began typing an email to her office, an idea forming as she recalled the resilience she had witnessed. It was time to propose an initiative that focused on empathy and support within her team, something she'd put off for too long. Sam Rivers passed by, suitcase in tow, and gave her a nod. "Take care, Lisa," he said. His voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there at the beginning of the flight. "You too, Sam," Lisa replied, smiling as she hit send on the email. The lessons of the flight stayed with her, prompting changes she knew would ripple outward. As the Caldwells reached their car, Brandon lingered, glancing back at the terminal. The image of Maya's calm, determined face and the paper crane she held wouldn't leave him. He took a breath and promised himself that the next time he was faced with a choice, he'd remember today. "Ready?" Nathan's voice cut through his thoughts, businesslike as always. But for once, Brandon didn't respond with automatic indifference. "Yeah, I am," he said, looking up at his father with a hint of newfound determination. Vanessa noticed and squeezed his shoulder again, hopeful that this was just the beginning. The Thompsons settled into their rental car, the hum of traffic blending with the rhythmic beat of Maya's quiet humming. James adjusted the rearview mirror and caught Maya's reflection, her eyes focused out the window, deep in thought. Elise turned in her seat to look at her daughter. "Are you thinking about your drawing?" Elise asked, a smile playing at her lips. Maya nodded. "And about that boy Brandon," she said. "I think he wanted to be different by the end." James nodded thoughtfully as he navigated the car onto the highway. Sometimes people don't know they're ready to change until they're shown another way. Today, he saw something different, he said, glancing at Elise, who met his eyes with quiet understanding. Later that evening, the family sat in their hotel room, the view of San Francisco's skyline glittering through the large window. Maya was sprawled on the floor with her sketchbook, adding finishing touches to the drawing of the crane surrounded by clouds. Elise watched her daughter, recalling the moments on the plane when Maya had held herself so bravely. "You handled yourself well today," Elise said, breaking the silence. "Not just with your drawing, but with everything." Maya looked up, surprised. "I was scared, but I didn't want to show it," she admitted. James leaned forward from his chair. "Being brave doesn't mean not feeling scared. It means facing what makes you afraid and moving through it," he said. Maya nodded, absorbing the words as she looked back at her sketch. The next morning, Jason Perez sat at a cafe, the sun filtering through the large windows and warming the wooden tables. He sipped his coffee, flipping through his phone, where an article about the previous day's flight caught his eye. It mentioned James Thompson's brief but powerful statement at the airport, and how the experience had resonated with passengers. Jason's thoughts drifted back to Maya, her quiet smile and the way she had drawn strength from her family. He felt a renewed sense of purpose as he finished his coffee, promising himself that he would carry that sense of empathy into every flight, every passenger interaction, no matter how routine it seemed. At her office, Lisa Morgan stood in front of her team, an assortment of coworkers who were accustomed to her efficient, no-nonsense demeanor. Today, she felt a different energy as she cleared her throat. "I want to share something," Lisa began, meeting the eyes of those around her. "I was on a flight recently that reminded me how small acts of kindness and resilience can change everything. We talk about productivity and deadlines, but we need to talk about support and understanding too." The room was quiet, attentive. Lisa knew she had taken the first step toward fostering a more connected environment, one where the little things mattered as much as the big goals. Brandon sat at his desk in his room, staring at the half-finished homework in front of him. The events of the flight replayed in his mind: the turbulence, Maya's silent courage, and the paper crane he had folded. It was a strange feeling, recognizing his own mistakes and wanting to be better. With a deep breath, he pulled out a clean sheet of paper and folded another crane, this time with more care. He placed it on his shelf as a reminder of what he'd learned. The next day at school, when he saw a classmate sitting alone, he hesitated only a moment before walking over. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" Brandon asked. The other boy looked up, surprised, and nodded. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. The Thompsons gathered for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the bay, the city lights twinkling like stars. Maya's sketchbook lay on the table, open to her drawing of the crane. A waiter paused, admiring the artwork. "That's beautiful," he said. "Did you draw that from memory?" Maya nodded shyly. "It's from something that happened on the plane," she said. The waiter smiled and moved on, but Elise watched Maya with a proud glimmer in her eyes. "Every day has a lesson," Elise said, breaking the moment of quiet. "Sometimes it's for us, and sometimes it's for others." James raised his glass. "To lessons learned and shared," he said. They clinked glasses, the toast simple but meaningful. The airline issued a press release announcing new initiatives inspired by James Thompson's speech and the events on the flight. Training sessions focused on empathy, recognizing bias, and creating a welcoming environment for all passengers were put into place. Jason read the internal memo with satisfaction. It felt good to know that small actions could lead to broader change, reinforcing that he was part of something more than just a job. When Maya returned to school, her teacher, Mrs. Atkins, asked her to share a story from her trip. Maya stood at the front of the class, holding her sketchbook and telling them about the flight, the paper crane, and what it had meant. "And sometimes, even when people aren't nice, they can change," Maya said, glancing at the paper crane she had brought with her. "You just have to give them a chance." The class listened intently, and after she finished, a few kids clapped, their faces thoughtful. It was just another day at school, but Maya felt like it was more. A chance to share something that mattered. Over the next weeks, conversations about kindness, courage, and change became common at Lisa's office, among passengers on Jason's flights. And within Brandon's school, the small seeds planted during that flight grew in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Elise and James, reflecting on the flight one evening, sat on their porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Sometimes it's not just about how we handle the big challenges," James said. "It's about what we do with the little moments that follow." Elise nodded, watching the colors fade into twilight, "And how we pass those lessons on." Maya, sitting nearby with her sketchbook, smiled as she traced the outline of another crane, its wings open wide as if ready for the sky. Weeks after their flight, Maya sat at the dining table with her parents, working on a project for school. The paper crane she had drawn and the one Brandon had folded sat beside her, inspiring her to create a story titled A Flight of Change. The story detailed a journey that started with turbulence and ended with understanding, echoing what she experienced on that memorable day. As she wrote, she paused and looked up at Elise. "Mom, do you think people really change, even when they don't mean to?" Elise smiled, setting down her coffee mug. "Yes, Maya. Sometimes they just need the right moment to see themselves differently." Maya nodded, her heart lighter as she returned to her story. In her words, she wove lessons she learned, not just from her parents, but from the quiet acts of bravery she had witnessed in herself and others. Brandon found that the days following the flight felt different. He walked through the school halls, noticing things he had previously ignored. A student struggling to pick up dropped books, another sitting alone at lunch. The memory of Maya's calm, determined face came back to him in these moments, urging him to act. During a free period, Brandon spotted Kyle, a boy in his class who often kept to himself, sketching in the corner of the library. Brandon hesitated for only a second before sitting down across from him. "Is that a drawing?" he asked, peering at the page. Kyle looked up, surprise in his eyes. "Yeah, just something I'm working on," Kyle replied, his voice uncertain. Brandon nodded, a small smile forming. "I know someone who draws. She's pretty good. Maybe you could meet her sometime." Kyle's eyes brightened, and for the first time, Brandon felt the shift in his own heart. A lightness that came from reaching out, from being better. Jason Perez's role at the airline took on a deeper meaning after that flight. During one particularly busy shift, he found himself face-to-face with a passenger who seemed anxious. The older man's brow was furrowed, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest. Jason leaned down, his voice calm and friendly. "First time flying?" he asked. The man nodded, surprised at the attention. Jason smiled, remembering Maya and the quiet strength she displayed. "I've learned that the hardest part is trusting that the wings will hold us. But they do, every time." The man's eyes softened, and he nodded. Jason continued down the aisle, feeling the reassurance of his own words. The flight had taught him that even small reassurances could mean the world to someone. Lisa Morgan's decision to foster a more supportive environment at work bore fruit in unexpected ways. One afternoon, she held a meeting with her team that focused solely on celebrating their small victories and sharing stories of perseverance. It was a departure from the typical agenda of numbers and deadlines, but it brought smiles and laughter she hadn't seen in months. As the meeting concluded, one of her team members, Rachel, approached. "Thank you for today, Lisa. It was nice to be reminded that we're more than just our work." Lisa felt a warmth spread through her, echoing the lesson she had taken from Elise Thompson's quiet strength and the way Jason had watched over the passengers. It was clear that even outside of the sky, the flight's impact continued to spread. Maya's story won a small prize at her school's creative writing contest, earning her a spot to read it aloud during a school assembly. As she stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, she spotted Brandon sitting in the second row. He gave her a small nod, and she felt her confidence grow. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay steady when the world shakes," Maya read, her voice clear. "And sometimes kindness can unfold like wings." The audience clapped as she finished, and Maya felt a swell of pride. Later, Brandon approached her as the crowd dispersed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper crane, newly folded and crisp. "I made this for you," he said, offering it with a shy smile. "Thanks for being brave." Maya's smile widened as she accepted the crane. "Thanks for learning," she replied. James sat at his office desk one evening, the city lights flickering through the window behind him. He picked up a framed photo of the family, taken years ago on a summer vacation. That flight had reminded him of the lessons they had worked so hard to teach Maya. The importance of facing life with strength and compassion. Even when faced with challenges, his phone buzzed and he saw a text from Elise. "Just thinking about today. Proud of us and of Maya." James smiled and typed back, "Me too. It all matters, doesn't it?" The response came back quickly. "Yes, every moment." At home, Vanessa Caldwell sipped her tea, watching Brandon work on an art project at the kitchen table. The quiet was interrupted only by the scratch of pencil on paper. She had watched her son change since the flight, and while it wasn't an overnight transformation, it was real. "You're doing well, you know," she said, breaking the silence. Brandon looked up, eyes meeting hers with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thanks, Mom." It was a simple exchange, but it was enough. Vanessa felt the warmth of hope blossom inside her, a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. The airline's Wings of Change program launched with success. Stories from staff and passengers filling internal bulletins and newsletters. Jason was asked to speak at a training seminar where he shared the story of the Thompsons and how it had reshaped his view of service and connection. As he spoke, he spotted faces in the audience nodding in recognition, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the message. The ripple effect of one flight, he realized, could reach farther than anyone expected. Maya sat by her bedroom window, the sun setting over the city, casting golden hues across her room. The two paper cranes rested side by side on her desk, symbols of a journey that had changed more than just miles on a map. "Ready for dinner?" Elise called from the kitchen. "Coming," Maya replied, but before she left her room, she touched the cranes one last time, feeling the strength they represented. As she joined her parents at the table, laughter and conversation filled the space. The story of the flight and the lessons it carried would be retold in small moments throughout their lives, reminders that even the smallest gestures could change a day, a heart, and perhaps even a lifetime. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow along for more tales of courage, empathy, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support means so much and helps keep stories like these coming your way.